Welcome to another episode of the Plutus Awards podcast. Our community is filled with hundreds of stories from creators and entrepreneurs just like you. And through this show, we share these stories of challenges and successes from bloggers to podcasters, from writers, speakers, and more. I'm your host, Michelle Jackson. Today's guest is Terri Huggins-Hart, and in this episode, we discuss creating clarity around intentions within our business and understanding how ownership shows up in a freelance career. The tip Terri shared blew my mind.
I am Terri Huggins-Hart, an award-winning journalist and blogger, and I cover personal finance for national publications in addition to relationship stories.
How did you get into the personal finance space?
I got into personal finance because I was on a mission to pay off my student loans. And I wanted a way to document my blog. And to be quite honest, I haven't really documented it in years because paying off my student debt is no longer a priority for me. But that is how I got into personal finance, just starting with documenting my journey to pay off student loan debts, which I still do have that debt. And there was a point in time when I was working at a real estate office doing content marketing. That was my introduction into personal finance.
And how did you pivot that initial experience or interest into the business that you have now? And could you describe what your business is now?
Right now, my business is still personal finance related. I've just decided to, in addition to do personal finance journalism and content for other businesses, I've since added parenting to that scope. I've added bridal writing to that scope. And the main reason why I sort of took a detour away from personal finance is at the time when I first started, I found like a lot of the advice was very outdated, out of touch with reality. A lot of it was missing the fact that personal finance does not come down just to budgeting. It comes down to politics. It comes down to personal situations. It was honestly kind of depressing. I was careful to vary my scope so that I did not go down this depressing rabbit hole. So that's how I ended up balancing the two, personal finance as well as relationships, parenting, other content.
In the series that I'm recording right now for this season, we're talking about the different deadly sins in content creation. You'd create quite a bit of content, both for yourself as well as for other organizations. And I would love for you to share what you felt was a deadly sin that you inadvertently made within your business.
There's three sins I feel definitely hindered my business and the potential of wealth creation. One, my intentions. Two, connections. I spent way too much time doing everything by myself and not understanding the importance of networking with other people. And that was for several reasons. I started freelancing out of college because I graduated into a recession and there were no jobs. At the time, there also weren't that many people freelancing. I had to make up everything on my own. I learned as I went, and any success that I got, it was basically all me, as well as any failures. And because of that, and because I was able to have successes by myself, it took me a long time to understand the importance of creating my community and, those networking opportunities, because it's within your community that you understand different wealth building opportunities within that. They're the ones who can guide you on how to negotiate terms, how to better execute, how to create a better product, be clear on your service. You needed those people to bounce ideas off of. And I did not have that for a very long time. One thing that I realized it definitely impacted was my contract negotiating skills. I've realized that had I had a network or, coworkers, quote unquote, I would have had somebody explain to me that ownership is how you build wealth. And when you write for a lot of these publications, especially national publications, you are selling all your rights. So that means you don't own anything. Here I was writing stories for a bunch of big name brands. I mean, you name it, there's a good chance I've written for them. And I would get paid for them once. But because I sold all rights, there would be times that I'd see the same story that I wrote on a bunch of other publications. And I'm like, what the hell? I got paid for that once. Meanwhile, who knows how much they were selling my work for? Thanks to, communities that I've since joined, whether it's National Writers Union or freelance binders groups on Facebook, or just the coworkers that I've found on Twitter, I've learned that you can negotiate contracts and the importance. So rather than selling all rights, I've been very aware of negotiating for first rights. I'm no lawyer. I'm still learning this on my own. And sometimes I hit gold and I'm able to get those first rights in the contract. And sometimes it's all rights and I have to decide if it's worth it for me or not. For anybody who doesn't understand the difference between first rights and all rights, I'm no expert in this, or at least in contracts. I highly suggest you speak to a lawyer or somebody who is an expert on it. But when you sell all rights, you obviously don't own any of it. So you can write a story for any publication, whether it's a blog, a big publication like New York Times. And if you sell all rights, then that company can do whatever they want with that copy and you have no say. Let's say you write something amazing and it becomes a movie. You then get nothing from that movie, even though it was based on your story. Yes, it's not likely, but it's possible. Meanwhile, when you have first rights, you are selling the right for that publication to publish it for the first time. And then you retain, second rights. So you can maybe sell it to a newsletter or another blog or another publication. You could sell it in a book, etc. You really want to hold on to as many rights as you can, because again, ownership is how you build wealth. And that doesn't just go back to houses, stock markets, etc. Like it goes back to blogs. When you own your blog, when you own your newsletter, you have more potential to own that work and make more money from it. So I had learned that far too late in my career and realized that I was working way harder than I needed to, because the key is to, make something work, getting paid for it.
Terri, I was today years old when I learned this. And I hate to say this, but there are a lot of listeners right now who are like, wait, what? So this is huge. And my mind might be slightly blown right now. This is why we have these conversations, to be quite honest. Again, today years old, never heard of this in my life. And I've been doing a lot of content creation for organizations for years, had no idea. And through having your community that you built both via Twitter, via groups with similar interest groups, professional groups, this is how you're able to up-level your brand.
Exactly. And that was like the main key, because I was doing personal finance content and I was writing in the bridal industry. So everybody in my network at the time, they were, photographers, they owned venues, they were doctors, which was great. That's how I was able to get more work. But I didn't have enough of a network of writers who were able to tell me, like, girl, why are you signing away all your rights? And that's what I needed.
I'm literally asking myself this question. Wow. Literally, my mind is blown right now. So what have you done since discovering that information? And just what are some of the steps that you're taking to avoid making some of these mistakes within your business that we all make mistakes with? No one creates a business online and it's perfect. If you could just share some of the tips and tricks, and just what's your advice to folks who are listening to this show who are digital entrepreneurs in the personal finance space and they're really looking to up level what they're doing and their brand?
Really don't do too much out of excitement, because I honestly feel like you get that first assignment and you are excited, like, oh my God, they want me to write for them. So then you just go ahead and sign your life away without reading anything. Give it a day, read through the contract and see what's going on. And I found that after doing that, there's a lot of things in contracts that do not help freelance writers at all, which can hurt them down the line, because a lot of times we're one person and God forbid something happens, you're going against a huge media company who does not have your best interest in mind. So don't do anything out of too much excitement. Take a breath, read through everything. And if possible, whenever they send you an all rights contract, sometimes you all got to say, can I have a first rights contract, please? And I've actually found that some of them actually do have one waiting in the wings. They're just not sending it out first. They're waiting for somebody to ask for a first rates contract. That's definitely number one. Another one. Two, I think in terms of time, a big mistake that I made when I first started out, which again affected how much money I made, was not accurately tracking how long it took me to write things, especially pitches. As most of us know, pitches is how you get a lot of work. You got to put yourself out there for, great opportunities to come back. But at the end of the day, pitching is also unpaid labor. I had to keep track of how much time I was spending pitching and be very mindful of that. And one thing that I've started doing was setting a budget, for lack of better words, to help rein in the pitching. Let's say my budget is $100 a month to send a pitch to new to me editors. New to me editors, meaning it's less likely they're going to respond. It's just a market I want to break into. So I set this budget for $100 and I send out 4 pitches. So obviously that's my $100 is up. And that's when I'm done because I started paying myself as an incentive for sending pitches and sort of keep me on track. That was huge. So rather than always going out for new markets, once you are in a stable, you have your stable clients, it's better to do that then than when you're first starting out, because I understand you're just going to send to everybody. But once you are in that secure spot, you don't want to get carried away sending pitches way too often because you're just losing money. Focus on building the relationship that you do have. And when somebody comes up that seems right, that's when you reserve your time to send out that pitch.
How long does it take you to pitch? What does a pitch day look like?
Years ago, I used to have this mantra that I would send 10 before 10. Before 10 o'clock a.m., I had to send out 10 pitches to various publications, various businesses.
Every single day?
Every single day, 5 days a week.
All right.
That's how I started my career. But I realized I was still doing that years later. And I'm like, why am I doing this? I could use that time spent doing something else. Now it really varies. I don't really pitch as much as I used to. I really do try to limit it to 5 for new to me editors, because I do have relationships with a lot of publications now. So if I send them a pitch, it's very likely they're going to pick it up. But for new to me editors, just 5. And it does take me a bit of time because my background really is in journalism. When I send a pitch, I'm already doing like very thorough research and making sure that sometimes the stats that I use are not backed by a pharmaceutical company or a bank all the time because they're not necessarily unbiased in their researching. So when I send pitches, they are a lengthy process for me when I'm pitching for publications as a journalist, whether it's parenting topics, personal finance topics, etc. If I'm pitching like content marketing, I have a very basic form or template that I, just kind of plug in, and that doesn't really take me much time at all. That's how my pitching goes. I try to do mostly is just make sure that I am honest and putting out the best work possible. That way I don't have to pitch anybody ever again, because I'd rather the work just come to me.
There you go. I love everything about this, and I'm still kind of mind blown. Terri, have you developed any products? So right now you're doing services for large clients, but have you started to develop and create products behind the scenes as well?
I have. I've actually written several ebooks that make a sale here and there. And really, it's my own doing. Another sin, I guess you could say. I have a very hard time promoting certain products or myself in general. I will be completely honest in saying that if I actually promoted it, I'm sure I'd be selling a lot more, because I can very easily use the bylines behind my name. Like I've written for Real Simple and Investopedia and New York Times. And I could very easily, sort of use that as a marketing tactic to sell ebooks. But it's just something that I am having difficulty doing. And full disclosure, I am in therapy to discuss why I have problems hyping myself up, especially with people that I know. I have no problem hyping myself up with strangers, but with people who I think who would actually care about what I do, that's a struggle.
Is it imposter syndrome, or do you feel a little shy about what the feedback would be?
We haven't landed on this in therapy yet. We're still trying to figure it out. But I hesitate to say it's imposter syndrome And the only reason why is because as I do more research on it, I'm learning that imposter syndrome in a way places the blame on us as opposed to a society that has not been inclusive and allowed us to see ourselves, making it easier for us to talk ourselves up. So I hesitate to say it's imposter syndrome. There's something about it, to be quite honest. I think it's because it's who I am. It's really putting myself out there. I grew up as a performer, as a dancer. One of my side hustles to pay off student loans was a brand ambassador. I was all over the place promoting, things at alcohol, at concerts, at amusement parks, bars. So I was always talking to everybody, but that wasn't me. That was a persona. Like, but
wow.
To be me and say, I wrote this book. It's me revealing myself to the world in a way, like who I truly am. And that's scary. But of course, I know that is also hindering my potential to make more money.
But you know what? Like, I feel like it's almost as if you're walking naked out in the street. You know what I mean? So when you're creating these products and sharing your work, there's a little bit of your soul attached to it. And the feedback on something that's soul focused and mission aligned, I think is very different than, like, I've been a brand ambassador too, and I've had a great time doing it, but it's very different from sharing a yogurt brand that you love to eat versus something that you live through.
Yes, that's it exactly. And I mean, and to your point, that's sharing someone else's brand as opposed to sharing me as a brand, like who I am, the essence, my babies that I put out into the world. It's definitely different. And it's something that I'm working through. And hopefully I'll figure that out in therapy.
You figure it out, let us all know, because I feel like there's a lot of us dealing with the same thing.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, but I have made progress. I mean, I'll tell you, it's to the point that I have even a hard time telling my friends and family what I do. My friends have this joke that they routinely have to Google me to see like what I did. She's like, what actually the friend I just saw not too long ago, she's like, I routinely Google you because I'm like, you probably won a Pulitzer and we have no idea because you didn't tell nobody.
But you know what? I have a question. When you first started doing your online based work, did people even understand what you were doing? Because one of the challenges that I had in the beginning of my business was getting people to get what I was doing. And I did get really frustrated for quite a while, especially with my family, because they like work for them is not what I do. You know what I mean? Like work is supposed to be hard in a different way, like labor, if you know what I mean. Like my grandma drove a forklift in a plant. So she was the first woman to do this. And she was Black. She drove a forklift in this plant in the Midwest. Most of my older relatives in particular, they had very hard physical labor related work. And so then you've got yourself and myself and all these other people doing what is difficult work, but it's difficult in a very different way. And I think that sometimes people just, it's a very abstract and strange thing. Was there ever feedback in the beginning? Like, what the hell are you even doing?
That's a really good question. And I have answers that can go so many different ways. So in one sense, yes, I totally agree that it's that nobody knew what I was doing back then. I mean, I graduated college in 2009. I started freelancing full time 2010. And it wasn't really a talked about thing at the time. There was the problem of trying to explain to people what I did, but partly I think I'm a first generation American. My family is from Trinidad. It's also sort of like, it's sort of a privilege to do what you're passionate about. You hear stories of my parents coming here to this country, having nothing to their name, didn't know they had to pay taxes, had to figure out New York by themselves. And my dad worked at gas stations and was a real estate agent and worked at a grocery store all at the same time. My mother did a whole bunch of other stuff. To a point, it was sort of hard to get them to understand, like, yeah, I can make a career out of this. But on the other hand, I didn't care. I think back then I was in my 20s and as much as I hate to admit this, I had a different fire about myself. You get out of college, you're sort of like fearless, like the world is in the palm of your hands. So people didn't get it, but at the same, I didn't necessarily care when I was 21. So it's twofold. But the other part, going back to being a first gen, and as you mentioned, imposter syndrome, when you have parents who are immigrants, you often hear stories from them about how people would say, oh, well, you're lucky to have this job because they're immigrants. So when you're told all the time that you're lucky to have this job, you forget that you can be lucky and still ask for more money. You can be lucky and still negotiate and ask for what you're worth. That's why I always feel very strongly that it's definitely a different fight for children of immigrants because it affects how you look at money in so many ways and how you look at business in so many ways, because you're constantly battling the idea that your parents would have been happy to just have this and you don't want to look ungrateful.
So you know what? I hate to say this, but that happens a lot in African-American families,
right?
Where it's like any kind of work is good work. I'll talk personally, like the idea that I'm looking for work that also satisfies my soul in addition to getting me paid. That is just like, really? like work isn't about that. It's just to pay the bills and you're lucky to have it. And so I'm very lucky because I'm the oldest grandchild and I am the favorite, I have been told, even though my family has been like, we don't quite understand what's happening with you. I've never had them put down what I was trying to do. They just didn't understand it because for them, this wasn't an option. This is a new thing.
Yes, I can definitely say I relate to that. I am fortunate that my parents never really, or any of my family really never put me down. They just didn't get it. I can definitely say that rings true to me as well. It's just interesting to navigate as a Black woman or people of color at all, because like you said, it was a privilege to do anything that would light your soul on fire, follow your passion. We could say that plays into imposter syndrome, if we want to call it that.
If you were a person listening, a personal finance entrepreneur listening to this episode, what's the thing that you would want them to take away from your experiences? Like, what's the one thing that they should do to avoid making a sin within their business that could impact them long-term without them even knowing it?
One thing that I definitely tell everybody, including myself, is to accept that the people that come before you that give you advice, in the personal finance industry as a freelancer, they may give you advice that works, but we have to acknowledge that their way is one way. It's not the only way. I found myself following advice for some people that did not ring true to me. And once I deviated sometimes and went against what people said, that's when I got the most success. So obviously you build a community, you get your network in your field, you find your coworkers, and yes, listen to your advice, go through it as necessary, and then do what feels right to you. And that is how you make the money. You can't always follow everybody else. You just weed through it as necessary.
Well, I feel like that's a great way to end this conversation. I'm looking forward to re-listening to this because my mind is still blown on the rights thing. It's never come up. That was huge to me. It was huge for me, actually.
I mean, This is something that I just realized maybe in the last year or two. So I'm still trying to figure it out. But it's funny because the things that I used to celebrate all the time are the things that I realize aren't necessarily celebration worthy in terms of money. Because, let's say you write something for like the Huffington Post, and then you always see people like, oh my God, it got picked up by Yahoo, which is great. But did Yahoo pay you?
Oh.
Like, nah, Yahoo didn't pay you. Huffington Post likely got some coins for reselling that.
Actually, it's funny that you bring this up because I got salty with someone because they're looking to grow their freelance projects and they've freelanced before. And I was like, not salty with them, but salty with a client about a client. I was like, look, that client that you're writing for, who's paying you $250 a post, is getting so much ad revenue on their website from your viral work because this person has viral work such as yourself. I was like, you're doing $250 posts In less than a day, they have more than recouped their cost for investing in a payment for you to do a project for them. And so I was like, you need to prioritize the clients who pay more.
Exactly.
Because I think the other part is we need to understand what the business model is. Like for those of us who are doing freelance work or contract work, we have to really understand the model of business that these clients are doing and how they're making income. A good example of this is all the content around Harry and Meghan.
Oh, yes.
And it's crazy to me, first of all, because it is very clear that for certain papers in the UK, the ad revenue clicks are significantly higher for the negative posts that they're writing because they don't do well here in the US. You don't see it. It's so obvious that American fans are like, we know that you make money this way because we understand the business model.
Yes. And you know what? That's it exactly. And that's really what hindered my wealth building potential. Because in the beginning, I didn't know to negotiate contracts because I didn't understand the business model. I just kind of jumped into freelance writing, like, all right, well, there's no jobs because I graduated into a recession. Let's do this now. Maybe I didn't take enough time to understand the business model. Or, I think it was also very hush hush. People are more open about it now than they were back then also. But without understanding that business model, like I now know that really negotiating for all rights is in a way is still writing for exposure when you really think about it. Because again, you do this for these big publications and yeah, they syndicate it other places, but you're not getting any money. They're just exposing your work to other places. And we all know not to write for free or for exposure, but yet we still do it when we are selling all our rights to these huge companies.
Man, these companies are about to get a whole bunch of pushback from all the writers listening to this. And I love it. I love every second of it. I love it.
People don't respect writers. That's the problem. If people see it as just an art, they don't see it as a business. And unfortunately, a lot of writers don't necessarily understand it either. So not only are their writers not seeing themselves as a business, but they're also not seeing themselves as business owners. So they have this employee mindset as opposed to, like a entrepreneur mindset. And that changes everything. Once you realize that they are not your employer, it makes it much easier for you to push back on things and say, I'm not doing it. However, I will say it is much easier for me to negotiate and push back and say no to these things now because I've already established enough prestigious publications behind my name. So I am totally transparent about that. I understand if you are just starting out in personal finance and you want to write for, Wall Street Journal or any other big publications and you're just starting out, it's going to be much harder for you to negotiate. But I'm at a point where prestige doesn't really matter to me anymore because I already have those prestigious names.
You've already built up the brand authority. And I think that this is the last point that I think is important to touch on before we wrap up. When people in the personal finance space are building up their businesses, I think we spend, rightfully so, a lot of time focused on the authority part of our business, things like getting the prestigious projects and things like that. And that is important because we do need to validate our experience and our knowledge and that kind of thing. But there's a point where it can also be a distraction. You can publish or be seen in probably a lot fewer platforms than we realize when you can pivot and really focus on growing your brand in terms of earnings. I made that mistake where I think I was kind of distracted by the names longer than I should have been instead of pivoting and really focusing on it's time to make money and there's a lot of money to be had in this space. What are the things do I really need to focus on? And that's the last question for you is for a freelancer in this space, what are the things that people really need to be focusing on to earn their money?
I think one thing they need to focus on are their boundaries, because if you don't set any, people will create them for you and they may not always be in your favor. And boundaries in regards to a lot of things, whether the turnaround time for a story, how many edits you're willing to make, the pay negotiations. Like I'm not working for something that's going to take 60 plus days to get paid. Focus on your boundaries, set them and be as firm with them as possible, because those boundaries it's really what's going to dictate your potential growth for your business going forward.
How can we follow and support you?
You can follow me on social media, Terrific Words. I also have a website, terrificwords.com, and I'm in the middle of creating terrihuggins.com. And that's it. I'm always happy to give advice to people who are trying to get into freelance writing. I am not an expert in it, but I know a lot, and I like to give people the good, the bad, and the ugly in the industry so we can all make money. So if anybody needs a little guidance or somebody who gets it, I'm here.